Hi, I'm Dr. Celine Latulip from the Department of Computer Science at the University of Manitoba. As part of this NSF Create curriculum, I'm going to talk to you today about how ethics comes into play in human-centered design, and I'm going to introduce myself. So, I got my PhD in computer science from the University of Waterloo back in 2006, and then I moved to the United States and spent 14 years at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Last year, I was lucky enough to come back to Canada and I joined the University of Manitoba, and I'm in the Department of Computer Science there. So my research is human-computer interaction-based, and I tend to focus on three areas. Most recently, I'm focusing on aging, older adults, and caregivers and how they use technology together. I also do a lot of work in computer science education, and I've historically done lots of work in the area of digital creativity support. So that's me. So how does ethics come into play when you're doing research? Most of you probably know that there are ethics protocols that you have to submit when you're doing human subjects research, but that's not the only place where ethics comes into play. And I want to show you how this is actually much more prevalent in everything that we do. So when you build a device, whether you're designing a new smartphone or a smart walker or some kind of data sensor, you are using ethics. Every interface that you design, the ways that you allow people to interact with a device or a system that you build, also any metric that you devise, so a survey that you design to collect data, and any wide-scale data set collection that you are in charge of obtaining and maintaining, all of these things have in common the fact that they embed values, and there are ethical implications to the way values are embedded in all of those things. So as a person who is potentially designing technology to help older adults, you have an obligation to consider all of the stakeholders. Now, of course, in human-centered design, if we're designing for older adults, they are going to be front and center in all of our processes. But you also have to consider the older adult's spouse if they have one, their family and friends, and how whatever you're designing may impact them. There may be healthcare providers that work with the older adult, doctors, occupational therapists, social workers, etc. So how does what you design or the data you collect actually impact those people? Other community members in the area where the older adult lives, whether it's in an assisted living facility or out in a neighborhood somewhere. There are also environmental impacts that affect everybody, of course, that you should consider, such as energy usage. And then taxpayers. Think about what you're designing. If it was adopted at a wide scale, is this something that society can actually afford? Does it make sense? And if we're thinking about older adults and mobility, and you design some new system or some way of collecting data on how older adults move about, that may impact the transit system and transit workers. So at this point, I'd like you to pause the video, take a minute, take out a notebook, and think about, for the project that you're working on, who else would you need to consider to make sure that you are thinking about all of the stakeholders and all of the people who might be impacted by what you are designing. Okay, let's move on to talk about something called Techno-solutionism. This is some text from a site that was written by the Future Computing Association. So these are up-and-coming computer science academics. And this is just really well written. I encourage you to go and read it all, but I want to read some of it to you. So they say, the current status quo in the community is to frame our research by extolling its anticipated benefits to society. In other words, rose-colored glasses are the normal lenses through which we tend to view our work. And they go on to say, one glance at news these days reveals that focusing exclusively on the positive impacts of a new computing technology involves considering only one side of the story. The negative impacts of our research are increasingly high-profile, pervasive, and damaging. And they give some examples. Driverless vehicles and other types of automation may disrupt the careers of hundreds of millions of people. Generated audio and video, they're talking here about deepfakes, might threaten democracy. Gig economy platforms have undermined local governments. Crowdsourcing has been associated with sub-minimum wage pay. Mobile devices have increased vehicular deaths by the thousands, and they go on to give many more examples. And they go on to state at the end, there clearly is a massive gap between the real-world impacts of computing research and the positivity with which we in the computing community tend to view our work. We believe that this gap represents a serious and embarrassing intellectual lapse. The scale of this lapse is truly tremendous. It is analogous to the medical community only writing about the benefits of a given treatment and completely ignoring the side effects, no matter how serious they are. So, the computing community and engineering communities are relatively new in the sciences compared to things like physics and biology. And I think as research communities, we are starting to grow up and try to become more responsible. And I think that as a young researcher in this area, it's your obligation to be aware of this idea of techno-solutionism, just jumping to create a technology to solve everything without thinking through what are the potential negative side effects of that solution. So one of the really interesting ways that we can actually work through this in a productive way is through a process called speculative harm analysis. And what this involves is thinking creatively. So here I ask you to act like a dystopian science fiction writer and think about all the possible terrible things that someone could do with the technology or the technique or the data metric that you're working on. So one way to think about this is imagine that your project was really successful and got adopted widely across all of North America. Everybody was using it. Well, given that change, what social norms would form around this new technology? What current laws do we have that could regulate it, or would new laws need to be created? And thinking about individuals, what kinds of ethical decisions would they have to make given that this technology is there and available and being widely used by other people? So this is not to say that if you do this and you think of negative impacts, you stop designing and we don't want to stifle innovation. We don't want to say all technology is bad. But the point of doing something like speculative harm analysis is that it enables us to anticipate negative impacts and then proactively put mechanisms in place to either prevent or mitigate those negative impacts. So again, I'd like you to pause the video, stop and think. How does the world change if your idea, your project, what you're working on is adopted on a wide scale? So imagine everybody in North America starts using it. How does the world change, and what are some potential negative side effects of that? Okay, so now on to what you were probably expecting to hear about in this video, which is the idea of ethics training as it relates to research. So in Canada, the Tri-Council agencies have come up with a policy statement. So it's the TCPS, and it's about ethical conduct for research involving humans. So the TCPS2, because this is the sort of second version of it, is a training that's on the web that you will need to go through. It takes about 3 to 4 hours, and it will walk you through a lot of case studies of human subjects research that has gone wrong to help you think through what are the potential problems and issues you need to consider when conducting research with human participants. So once you've done that training and you are getting ready to think about designing and running a study that involves human participants using whatever it is that you've designed, you will need to submit a research ethics protocol to the Research Ethics Board on your campus. That's called the REB. And the protocol will ask many, many questions. These are quite long. It takes quite a while to actually complete these protocols. And it will ask questions like what you see here. So what is the research purpose? What methods and instruments are you going to use? Who are your participants? Who are you going to recruit? What demographics are they from? And are any of the participants you want to recruit from vulnerable populations, such as children or indigenous communities, etc.? There's also privacy, confidentiality issues that you need to address. So who's going to have access to the data that you collect? How are you going to protect the privacy of your research participants. And if you're collecting health information, there's a whole nother level of privacy and confidentiality that you need to address. What are the risks to people who are participating in your study, and what are the benefits directly to them? There may be benefits to the research community, but are there any direct benefits to those participants? And how are they going to be compensated for their participation? How are you going to go about recruiting them? And how do you make sure that you are not in a position of power in which you could coerce participants? That's not generally considered okay. And do you have any kind of conflict of interest, such as a financial interest in a company that's being formed whose technology you're studying? And then data management, the data that you collect, where is it going to be stored? Who will have access to it? How long will you keep it? How will it be destroyed? And when will it be destroyed? And then there are issues around informed consent, and this is especially really critical with older adults, especially if they may be exhibiting signs of mild cognitive decline. How do you ensure that they are continuously, enthusiastically consenting to participate in your study? If you're using deception, how are you going to make sure that you debrief participants to explain to them that they were deceived as part of the study? And then feedback and dissemination is important. How are you going to give information back to those participants in your research program to give them the results of your research? And where are the results of your research going to be disseminated? And will user quotes be included in that dissemination? These are all the types of questions that you will need to answer in creating a research ethics protocol for studying how human subjects might use your device or system or what have you. So again, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and stop and think about all of the different things that you may need to consider in writing an ethics protocol. And there's some questions on the screen that you can sort of look through just to give you a sense of all of the types of things that you do need to consider. So to recap, what we talked about today is the way that ethics are embedded in research at a high level in terms of the fact that there are values in everything that you design, in your research questions and in your survey metrics, in the systems and the interfaces that you design. And given that your values are being embedded in these things, you have an ethical obligation to consider the positive and negative impacts, not just on the target participant population, but also on other people and on society in general. And then when it comes to actually running studies with human participants, you need to consider those human participants, and you have a legal obligation to have finished the TCPS training and to complete an institutional REB protocol, which needs to be submitted to the REB board, reviewed, and approved before you can even start recruiting participants for your research. Thanks very much for watching. Please feel free to email me if you have questions.